How does a man who performs puppet shows for children become one of Philadelphia's most notorious serial killers? What drives someone to sleep peacefully above the bodies of their victims? When children gathered to laugh at his Cookie Monster puppet, did anyone suspect the horror that lay just steps away? Behind boarded windows and locked doors, Harrison Graham was hiding more than just his Cookie Monster. He was concealing 7 brutal murders. What twisted logic allows a killer to entertain children by day while collecting corpses by night? The summer of 1987 hung heavy over Philadelphia, a thick blanket of heat wrapping around the city like a suffocating embrace. In a rundown neighborhood where hope seemed as scarce as working streetlights, an old apartment building stood as a silent witness to the darkness that lived within its walls. On August 9th, as storm clouds gathered overhead promising relief from the oppressive heat, residents of 1631 North 19th Street noticed something was different about their neighbor, Harrison Graham. The 28-year-old man, known throughout the neighborhood for his constant companion, a Cookie Monster puppet he carried everywhere, was acting stranger than usual. Children who once laughed at his silly impersonations of the beloved Sesame Street character now watched from behind curtained windows as he frantically moved about his third-floor apartment. The building itself was a testament to urban decay, windows boarded up, hallways littered with debris, and an overwhelming sense of despair that seemed to seep from its very walls. But even in this place where the unusual was commonplace, something about Harrison Graham's apartment had been bothering his neighbors for weeks. It was the smell, a horrific, indescribable odor that grew stronger with each passing day of the summer heat. When the landlord finally demanded to inspect the apartment, Harrison's response was telling. Instead of complying, he nailed his door shut in a desperate act of defiance. Then, clutching his beloved Cookie Monster puppet, a bottle of water, and a handful of clothes, he disappeared down the fire escape like a shadow fleeing from the light. The police who arrived at the scene that day were already on edge. The city was still reeling from the recent capture of Gary Heidnik, another killer who had terrorized Philadelphia from just a few miles away. Simultaneously, the investigation into the mysterious Frankfurt slasher remained open, with a killer still at large in the very same neighborhood. Officer Pete Scatino, a veteran familiar with the area's darker side, approached the building with the weight of experience heavy on his shoulders. The moment they broke through Harrison's nailed-shut door, the truth hit them like a physical force. The smell, which had been bad in the hallway, became an overwhelming assault on their senses. In the dim light filtering through boarded windows, they found themselves standing in what could only be described as a nightmare made real. The apartment was a maze of horror. Waist-high piles of trash created twisted corridors through the darkness. Rotting food containers, newspapers yellowed with age, and piles of dirty clothes created a landscape of decay. But it was what lay beneath this chaos that would shake even the most hardened officers to their core. On the wall, a disturbing drawing of a naked woman had been defaced with crude language, the markings appearing to have been made with dried blood. The real horror lay behind a door marked with the name Marty. Through its keyhole, Officer Scatino made the first of what would become many grim discoveries. The unmistakable sight of a woman's legs, unnaturally still in the darkness. The subsequent investigation would reveal a truth more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Harrison Graham, the man who made children laugh with his puppet shows, had transformed his apartment into a house of horrors. As thunder rolled overhead and the promised storm finally broke, Philadelphia's law enforcement faced a chilling reality. They weren't just dealing with another tragic death in a neighborhood all too familiar with tragedy. They were standing at the threshold of what would become one of the city's most disturbing crime scenes. A place where the line between eccentric neighbor and monster had blurred into something almost incomprehensible. The Cookie Monster killer, as he would come to be known, had left behind a legacy of horror that would haunt the city for years to come. Like a scene from a nightmare, each layer of discovery revealed new horrors that tested the resolve of even the most seasoned detectives. Officer Pete Scatino and investigator Charles Johnson led the initial search. The third floor of the building was a maze of decay, with most windows boarded up and no working electricity. The darkness seemed alive, hiding secrets in its shadows. Their flashlight beams cut through the gloom, revealing walls covered in disturbing graffiti and crude drawings. The air was so thick with the stench of death that both men had to fight the urge to retreat. Behind the door marked Marty, they made their first horrific discovery: 2 bodies on a filthy mattress. One woman lay twisted unnaturally, her skin discolored and bloated from decomposition. Next to her, another victim was found wearing a distinctive t-shirt with PTOA and a red rose design. Both were in their late 20s or early 30s, and both had been dead for only a few days in the summer heat. As more officers arrived with additional lighting and equipment, the true scope of Harrison's crimes began to emerge. Beneath mountains of garbage, newspapers, and rotting food, they found a third body wrapped in sheets. This victim was nearly skeletal, suggesting she had been there for months. The scattered fragments of her clothing were the only clues to her identity. By 3:45 p.m., Detective James Hansen, fresh from closing the Heidnik case, arrived to supervise. His experienced eye noted disturbing similarities to other cases, but this was something different. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a tomb where a killer had lived among his victims. As the team cleared debris to photograph and document their findings, a fourth set of remains emerged. Each discovery brought new challenges. The bodies were in various states of decomposition, creating a timeline of death that stretched back months. The small apartment had become a makeshift cemetery, with victims buried under layers of trash and forgotten belongings. The most disturbing discovery came at 5:30 p.m., a fifth body wedged between 2 mattresses. The realization that Harrison had been sleeping on top of one of his victims sent shudders through the investigation team. The body was so decomposed that determining gender was initially impossible. This wasn't just murder. It was a display of complete disconnection from humanity. The search continued into the evening as storm clouds gathered. In a tiny closet just 6 inches deep, they found a 6th victim, bound with white electrical cord and wrapped in a sheet. The methodical way the body had been stored suggested a disturbing level of planning and organization. As night fell and rain began to pour, news of the discoveries spread through the neighborhood. Crowds gathered outside, watching in horror as body bag after body bag was carried out by masked officers. The building, already a symbol of urban decay, had become a monument to evil. The final horror awaited them on the roof. Unlike the other victims, the 7th body was found dismembered, hidden beneath a stained mattress in a decaying canvas bag. The head and torso were missing, leading investigators to search the surrounding area, including vacant lots where Harrison had been seen digging. In total, 7 women had met their end in this house of horrors. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of a killer who had lived among his victims, carrying on his daily life surrounded by death. The Cookie Monster puppet he had left behind seemed to mock the investigators, a children's toy in a place of ultimate darkness. As the investigation continued, the building was condemned. The remaining tenants were evacuated, leaving behind a place that would forever be marked by the darkness that had lived within its walls. For the investigators, the case was just beginning. For Philadelphia, it was another chapter in a dark period that had seen multiple serial killers operating within miles of each other. Just months after capturing Gary Heidnik, and with the Frankfurt slasher still at large, another monster had emerged from their streets. The manhunt for Harrison Graham would test not only the police department's resources but also reveal the complex bonds of family and community. The search began immediately after Officer Pete Scatino made his grim discovery. Police plastered Harrison's photo across the city. A tall, lean man with distant eyes, known for carrying a Cookie Monster puppet. Local newspapers ran dramatic headlines: Cookie Monster killer flees, 7 bodies found in North Philadelphia apartment, manhunt underway for puppet-carrying killer. The city buzzed with sightings. A waitress at an all-night diner claimed she served him coffee. A bus driver was certain he'd ridden the Broad Street line. Each report sent tactical teams rushing across Philadelphia, only to find they were minutes too late. The closest call came at the Cathedral of Deliverance Evangelistic Church, where witnesses described seeing a man matching Harrison's description getting a meal. He appeared vacant, they said, with glassy eyes and dirty clothes. Police arrived moments after he'd slipped away. Meanwhile, the investigation team worked to understand their quarry. They interviewed Harrison's mother, Lillian Graham Jeter, learning that her son had been diagnosed with mental health issues at age 12 and spent 2 years in a hospital. He'd struggled with drug addiction, particularly crack cocaine, which had forced her to kick him out of her home in 1979 when he was just 20 years old. The community's response was mixed. Some neighbors described Harrison as quiet and friendly, often doing handyman work around the area. Others recalled disturbing incidents, his conversations with the puppet, dancing alone in the streets, sudden mood swings. Children who had once laughed at his Cookie Monster impressions now had nightmares about the puppet. Day after day, as forensics teams continued their work at the apartment, the media coverage intensified. Local TV stations ran special reports about mental illness and drug addiction. Crime experts speculated about possible connections to other unsolved murders. The puppet angle particularly captivated the public's imagination, turning Harrison into a sort of urban boogeyman. Harrison's siblings joined their mother in making public appeals. "Stop running, son," Lillian pleaded during one emotional television appearance. "Whatever happened, we can work this out. Your family loves you." Their words seemed to float through the city, hoping to reach wherever Harrison was hiding. Finally, on August 17th, 8 days after the first bodies were discovered, Lillian's phone rang. It was Harrison, his voice tired and hungry. Mother's instinct told her this was her chance. She kept her voice steady, loving, as they talked about simple things. Was he eating? Did he need clean clothes? When he asked if she could bring him some food, she agreed immediately, arranging to meet at a street corner just blocks from his old apartment. As soon as she hung up, Lillian contacted the police. Officers Ed Spangler and Larry Bickey were chosen for the delicate task of making the arrest. They positioned themselves carefully, knowing they couldn't risk spooking Harrison and losing him again. When he appeared, walking slowly toward his mother, there was no dramatic chase, no violent confrontation. The Cookie Monster killer surrendered quietly, his puppet conspicuously absent. Back at the police station, as Harrison was processed and charged, his mother watched with tears in her eyes. The manhunt was over, but for the families of his victims, for the investigators piecing together his crimes, and for a city still struggling to understand how such evil could hide behind something as innocent as a children's puppet, the story was far from finished. To understand how Harrison Graham became the Cookie Monster killer, we must travel back through his troubled history, examining what shaped a handyman with a puppet into one of Philadelphia's most disturbing murderers. Born to a 17-year-old mother, Harrison's early life was marked by instability and confusion. Lillian Graham Jeter, despite her youth, tried her best to raise her eldest son in a loving environment. But from an early age, something was different about Harrison. He struggled to form relationships with other children, preferring to spend time alone, lost in his own world. At age 12, a pivotal moment occurred that would shape his future. Harrison was diagnosed with a mental disorder severe enough to require hospitalization. For 2 years, he lived in an institutional setting, separated from his family and struggling to understand his own mind. The specific diagnosis remained unclear, but the impact was profound. When he returned home, he was a changed person, carrying invisible scars that would never fully heal. The streets of Philadelphia became his escape. There, at a young age, he found what he believed was love from a male pimp who introduced him to both drugs and prostitution. This confusing relationship, part exploitation, part acceptance, created deep conflicts within Harrison about his sexuality, his faith, and his place in the world. His mother eventually managed to pull him away from street life, but the damage was done. Harrison's drug use, particularly crack cocaine, escalated to the point where Lillian had no choice but to force him out of her home in 1979. He was just 20 years old, mentally ill, addicted, and now homeless. It was during this period that Harrison acquired his trademark Cookie Monster puppet. What began as a simple toy became his constant companion, a buffer between him and a world he struggled to understand. Local children would gather to watch him perform with the puppet, his Cookie Monster voice bringing smiles to their faces. But behind this seemingly innocent facade, darker impulses were growing. Harrison found work as a handyman, showing surprising skill at fixing things despite his mental challenges. He moved into the apartment at 1631 North 19th Street, a building as broken as he was. His neighbors knew him as two different people: the quiet handyman who could fix anything, and the eccentric man who held conversations with his puppet while dancing alone in the streets. His apartment became a gathering place for drug users and sex workers, people living on society's margins like himself. Harrison developed a reputation for dealing drugs, but also for unpredictable behavior. Some women reported feeling uncomfortable around him, sensing something threatening beneath his childlike facade with the puppet. The contrast in his personality became more pronounced over time. He could be gentle and helpful one moment, violent and threatening the next. He began keeping notebooks filled with disturbing drawings, naked women, dismembered body parts, crude sexual imagery. A neighbor once witnessed him dangling a woman out of his window, her screams piercing the night before he pulled her back inside. Religious conflict tormented him. Harrison viewed himself as a Christian, yet struggled with what he saw as sinful aspects of his life: his drug use, his sexuality, his dark impulses. This internal battle manifested in the creation of multiple personalities: Marty, the friendly handyman; Junior, the childlike Christian; and Frank, the violent drug addict who hated women. Whether these personalities were genuine manifestations of mental illness or convenient explanations for his actions would later become a matter of legal debate. What was clear was that Harrison Graham was a man at war with himself, his demons eventually manifesting in acts of unthinkable violence. The Cookie Monster puppet, which had started as a source of innocent entertainment, became a symbol of his fractured psyche. Through it, he expressed a part of himself that could still connect with others, while hiding the darkness that was growing within him. The puppet was both his mask to the world and his confession, a bright blue reminder that monsters can hide behind the most innocent of faces. 7 women lost their lives at the hands of Harrison Graham, each of their stories representing more than just a statistic in Philadelphia's crime records. These were daughters, sisters, mothers, women with hopes, dreams, and families who loved them. Robin Deshazer, 29, was the first to fall victim to Graham's violence. A former girlfriend who knew about Marty, she met her end in January 1987. Friends described her as vivacious and street-smart, someone who could light up a room with her smile. Her mother, Amelia Deshazer, would later weep outside the courtroom, saying, "I guess justice was done, but I still hate him." Robin's remains were found dismembered, scattered between the apartment roof and a nearby basement, a testament to the killer's growing depravity. Mary Jeter Matthews, 36, was a mother of 5 whose absence left a gaping hole in her family's life. Her husband recognized her by the distinctive shirt he had bought her, a cruel detail that brought both closure and fresh pain. Mary had gone to buy drugs from Graham, a decision that tragically led to her death. Her children would grow up without their mother's love, their lives forever altered by one fatal choice. Sandra Garvin, 33, had a roommate who feared the worst when she didn't return from Graham's apartment. A regular in the neighborhood, Sandra was known for her kindness to others despite her own struggles with addiction. Her father, Leroy Artis, spoke of his devastating loss. "This has been one of the most excruciating phases of my life, just having to go there and sitting through it. I guess time heals all things." Cynthia Brooks, 27, worked odd jobs to support herself, dreaming of a better life. Those who knew her spoke of her determination to overcome her addiction, of plans to return to school. Her brother maintained a vigil outside the courthouse throughout Graham's trial, holding a photo of Cynthia in happier times. Barbara Mahoney, 22, was the youngest victim. A talented artist who sketched portraits on the street for tourists, she had moved to Philadelphia with dreams of attending art school. Her sketchbook, found among her belongings, showed the promise of a creative life cut brutally short. Patricia Franklin, 24, came from a close-knit family that never stopped searching for her. Her sister posted flyers throughout the neighborhood, refusing to give up hope even as weeks turned into months. The discovery of her body brought an end to their search but not to their pain. The final victim identified was Valerie Jameson, 25, whose unique physical features helped forensic sculptor Frank Bender create a lifelike reconstruction of her face. Her parents recognized her from the bust, their worst fears confirmed by a distinctive rib feature that matched their daughter's medical records. She had been missing for 6 months, her family living in desperate hope until the devastating identification. The identification process itself was a testament to the dedication of law enforcement and forensic experts. The medical examiner team, led by Robert L. Catherman, faced the challenging task of identifying bodies in various states of decomposition. They employed every available technique: dental records, personal effects, distinctive clothing, and in Valerie's case, the artistic skills of Frank Bender. The victims shared common threads in their stories: struggles with addiction, connections to the neighborhood, and fatal encounters with a man who masked his darkness behind a puppet's innocent face. Yet each was unique, with their own dreams, personalities, and loved ones left behind to mourn. Dr. Haskell Eskin, the forensic dentist, worked tirelessly to match dental records as families came forward with hopes and fears about their missing loved ones. 5 of the victims had undergone dental work, providing crucial evidence for identification. For the families, these confirmations brought a brutal mix of closure and renewed grief. The impact on the community was profound. In a neighborhood already struggling with poverty and addiction, the murders highlighted the vulnerability of women living on society's margins. Local organizations organized vigils, support groups formed for families of victims, and discussions began about better protecting at-risk women. Churches in the area held memorial services, remembering not just how these women died, but how they lived. Stories emerged of their kindness, their struggles, their humanity. At one service, Robin's mother spoke of her daughter's dream of opening a shelter for homeless women, a dream that would never be realized. Personal items found with the bodies told silent stories of lives in progress: Barbara's sketchbook, Mary's distinctive shirt, Valerie's earrings. These belongings, carefully cataloged by investigators, served both to identify the victims and to remind everyone that these were real women with real lives, not just names in a police report. The investigation of Harrison Graham's crimes began in the stifling heat of August 1987, unfolding into one of Philadelphia's most complex and disturbing cases. The city's police department, already stretched thin by 2 other active serial killer investigations, would find themselves facing challenges that would test both their professional skills and emotional resilience. Detective James Hansen led the investigation, having just wrapped up the Heidnik case. His experience with serial killers would prove invaluable as he pieced together the puzzle of Harrison Graham's crimes. The initial crime scene at 1631 North 19th Street presented unique challenges. With no electricity and most windows boarded up, investigators worked in near darkness, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom to reveal horror after horror. The forensics team, led by medical examiner Robert L. Catherman, faced the daunting task of processing a crime scene contaminated by years of accumulated garbage. Each piece of trash had to be carefully sorted and documented, as potential evidence could be hidden anywhere. They photographed everything, creating a meticulous record of the apartment's condition. Evidence collection proved particularly challenging due to the various states of decomposition. The 2 most recent victims, found on the mattress, provided the most useful forensic evidence. Their bodies, though degraded by the summer heat, still retained crucial clues. The discovery of a broken hyoid bone in one victim confirmed strangulation as the cause of death, a pattern that would emerge across multiple victims. The investigation took an unexpected turn when officers discovered the dismembered remains on the roof. This showed a different level of violence, suggesting an escalation in Graham's behavior. The search expanded to neighboring buildings, leading to the discovery of more remains in a nearby basement. The electrical cord used to bind some victims became a signature element, helping link the crimes together. Detective Hansen employed a methodical approach to building the case. He interviewed dozens of neighbors, piecing together Graham's daily routines and behaviors. The Cookie Monster puppet emerged as a crucial element in understanding the killer's psychology. Witnesses described Graham's interactions with the puppet, his use of it to entertain children, and his habit of holding conversations with it in the puppet's voice. The investigation also revealed Graham's drug connections. His apartment had served as a known drug den, complicating the investigation as potential witnesses feared coming forward. However, this aspect of his life provided valuable leads, as several victims had connections to the local drug scene. Forensic dentist Haskell Laskin played a crucial role in victim identification. His work with dental records helped confirm the identities of 5 victims, providing closure to searching families. The involvement of forensic sculptor Frank Bender proved particularly valuable in identifying Valerie Jameson, demonstrating the importance of artistic skills in modern criminal investigation. The discovery of Graham's notebooks filled with disturbing drawings provided insight into his mental state. Crime scene photographers documented pages showing crude sketches of naked women and dismembered body parts. These drawings, along with witness accounts of his behavior, helped build a psychological profile of the killer. Investigators also explored possible connections to other active cases. While Graham operated in the same area as the Frankfurt slasher and not far from where Heidnik had committed his crimes, distinct differences in methodology and victim selection helped investigators determine these were separate killers. This realization added to the growing concern about the number of active serial killers in Philadelphia at the time. The police department's evidence lab processed hundreds of items from the apartment. Personal effects found with the body's jewelry, clothing, personal items were carefully cataloged and photographed. These items would prove crucial in both identifying victims and building the case against Graham. Detective Hansen's interrogation of Graham after his arrest revealed both challenges and breakthroughs. Graham's initial claim that the bodies had been in the apartment when he moved in 4 years ago quickly fell apart under questioning. As Hansen pressed, Graham's story evolved, eventually leading to his confession to all 7 murders. The investigation had to carefully document Graham's mental state throughout the process. His claims about multiple personalities, Marty, Jr., and Frank, required evaluation by mental health professionals. The team had to determine whether these were genuine manifestations of mental illness or an attempt to avoid responsibility. The role of Graham's mother proved crucial to both the investigation and eventual prosecution. Her statements about his mental health history, including his hospitalization at age 12, helped build a complete picture of the killer's background. Her cooperation, while painful for her as a mother, provided valuable context for understanding Graham's development into a killer. Investigators also worked to understand the significance of the name Marty, carved into the door of Graham's makeshift tomb. This detail, along with Graham's later claims about his multiple personalities, added psychological complexity to the case. The team consulted with psychiatrists to understand how Graham's mental illness might have influenced his crimes. The investigation faced additional challenges from the building's condition. The structure was condemned during the investigation, forcing teams to work quickly to gather evidence before the site became too dangerous. The discovery of bones in the garden area required careful excavation, though these ultimately proved to be from dogs rather than human victims. Media attention complicated the investigation. While publicity helped generate leads, it also created pressure on the investigation team. They had to balance public safety concerns with the integrity of their investigation, carefully controlling what information was released to the press. Throughout the investigation, detectives maintained close contact with victims' families. Regular briefings kept them informed of progress while gathering additional information about the victims' last known movements. This communication proved vital in both solving the crimes and helping families cope with their losses. The investigation's thoroughness would prove crucial during the legal proceedings. Every piece of evidence was documented and preserved according to proper procedure, every witness statement carefully recorded, every detail of Graham's confession noted. This attention to detail would help ensure that Graham would face justice for his crimes. The case changed how Philadelphia police approached complex crime scenes. New protocols were developed for processing locations with multiple victims, and the department strengthened its relationships with forensic specialists. The investigation demonstrated the value of a multidisciplinary approach, combining traditional police work with forensic science and psychological analysis. In the quiet interrogation room of the Philadelphia Police Department, Harrison Graham began to tell his story. After 8 days on the run, exhausted and hungry, he was finally ready to talk. Detective James Hansen, who had pursued Graham through the streets of Philadelphia, sat across from him. The detective had just wrapped up the Heidnik case and recognized something familiar in Graham's eyes. The look of a man carrying dark secrets. Graham's mother, Lillian, insisted on being present during questioning, her presence both a comfort to her son and a witness to what was to come. Initially, Graham's story seemed absurd. He claimed the bodies had been in the apartment when he moved in 4 years ago. As Detective Hansen pressed gently but firmly, pointing out inconsistencies, the truth began to emerge. Hour by hour, Graham's facade cracked, revealing the horror beneath. The first admission came almost casually. "Yes," he said, "I killed the last 2, but Hansen knew there was more." As the interrogation continued, Graham's story expanded. He began to speak about Marty, a personality he claimed lived inside him. According to Graham, while his hands had done the killing, Marty was responsible. The most chilling aspect of Graham's confession was his description of the first murder. Robin Deschazer, a former girlfriend, knew about Marty and his desires. Graham explained, "I didn't want her looking at me that way, and I seen God being angry through her eyes. After killing her, he was so disturbed that he left her body in the apartment. It wasn't until he brought another woman home that he tried to hide the remains, moving them to the roof." As Graham continued to confess, a pattern emerged in his methodology. He would lure victims to his apartment by offering drugs. What began as consensual encounters would end in strangulation. Graham claimed to be shocked each time he woke to find a victim dead beside him, yet he continued to bring women to his apartment. The confession took a strange turn when Graham began discussing his multiple personalities. Beyond Marty, he spoke of Junior, a childlike Christian personality who loved his mother, and Frank, a homosexual streetwise drug addict who he claimed was responsible for the murders. Whether these personalities were real or fabricated for legal purposes would become a matter of intense debate. Throughout the interrogation, Graham displayed an unexpected artistic ability, sketching detailed portraits of his victims. The drawings showed a talent that surprised the detectives, who had expected the mentally disabled man to struggle with such tasks. He was also more articulate than anticipated, able to describe his crimes in clear, sometimes poetic language. His mother watched in horror as her son detailed each murder. She had raised him in the church, tried to guide him away from the streets, but now sat listening to him describe unthinkable acts. Yet she remained, providing both support for her son and crucial context for the investigators about his mental health history. Over several sessions, Graham produced a 10-page written confession. The document detailed every murder, though he consistently maintained they were accidents that occurred during sex. His writing revealed a man struggling with his actions, repeatedly insisting that the deaths were unintentional while providing details that suggested otherwise. The confession included descriptions of what he did with the bodies. He explained how he would wrap them in sheets, bind them with electrical cord, and conceal them within his apartment. He lived among his victims, sleeping on a mattress that concealed a decomposing body, carrying on his daily life surrounded by death. Detective Hansen noted how Graham's demeanor changed when discussing his victims. He showed genuine remorse at times, yet could also be disturbingly detached. When shown crime scene photos, he dismissed them as the actions of a very sick person, sometimes even chuckling at the images. The role of the Cookie Monster puppet emerged in his confession. Graham explained how the puppet helped him feel normal, allowed him to connect with others, particularly children in the neighborhood. The contrast between this seemingly innocent aspect of his life and his brutal crimes highlighted the complexity of his psychological state. Court-appointed psychologists evaluated Graham throughout the confession process. They found him to be calm, alert, and cooperative, though they identified several personality disorders. None believed these disorders would make him incapable of standing trial, despite his claims about multiple personalities. Graham's confession raised questions about potential additional victims. When asked directly, he maintained there were only 7, but investigators noted patterns in his behavior that suggested there might be more. The assistant district attorney told reporters the books might not be closed. Throughout the confession, Graham maintained an almost childlike demeanor, often asking about his Cookie Monster puppet and appearing confused about the gravity of his situation. Yet his detailed recollection of the murders and artistic recreation of his victims' faces showed a clarity that contradicted this appearance. Details emerged about his relationships with some victims. Mary Matthews, he claimed, was pregnant with his child, though this was later proved false. He spoke of Sandra Garvin as someone he had known for years through the neighborhood drug scene. Each victim had a connection to him, however brief, before their deaths. The confession process was complicated by Graham's drug use. He admitted to being high during many of the murders, using crack cocaine heavily throughout the period. This raised questions about the reliability of his memories and his state of mind during the crimes. Graham's lawyer, Joel Moldovsky, would later challenge the confession's validity, arguing that his client's mental state and the lengthy interrogation made it inadmissible. However, the detail and consistency of Graham's account, along with the physical evidence, made the confession powerful evidence. The legal case against Harrison Graham began with a fundamental question. Was a man who carried conversations with a Cookie Monster puppet mentally fit to stand trial? The pre-trial hearings opened in Philadelphia's criminal court with this crucial debate. Harrison's defense attorney, Joel Moldovsky, argued passionately that his client was not competent. He presented expert witnesses, including psychologist Dr. Stanton, who testified that Harrison had an IQ of 63, below the threshold for legal competency. According to Dr. Stanton's evaluation, Harrison suffered from hallucinations, psychosis, blackouts, and chronic paranoia. Dr. Albert Levitt, another defense expert, testified that Harrison lacked basic academic skills like reading, writing, math, and telling time. However, Judge Edward McKell found this testimony at odds with the coherent, detailed confession Harrison had provided to detectives. The judge relied heavily on the prosecution's expert, Dr. Robert Sard, who maintained that Harrison had been fully aware and competent during his interrogation. In October, Harrison entered a not guilty plea in a manner that seemed to support his lawyer's concerns about his mental state. When Judge McKell asked if he understood what was happening, Harrison simply replied, "Nope." He claimed not to know where he was and said he just wanted to go home. Assistant District Attorney Roger King suggested Harrison was merely pretending to be confused. The evidence hearing brought the horror of Graham's crimes into stark focus. Over 100 graphic crime scene photos were introduced into evidence. When these were displayed, Harrison's behavior was puzzling. He dismissed them as the actions of a very sick person, while sometimes chuckling at the images. The medical examiner investigator, Charles Johnson, methodically presented each photograph, with Judge Robert Latrone stepping down from the bench to examine them closely. The trial took an unexpected turn when Paula, a former girlfriend, took the stand. She testified about living with Harrison for 3 years, during which he regularly strangled her during sex, sometimes until she lost consciousness. According to Paula, Harrison had admitted to killing Robin Deschazer because she planned to leave him. Even more disturbing, she claimed he had confessed to practicing necrophilia with the corpse. This testimony triggered an outburst from Harrison, who accused Paula of lying. The defense quickly challenged her credibility, noting that her account of Robin's death contradicted the physical evidence. She claimed strangulation while evidence suggested beating. Mary Hogan, who had previously shared her story anonymously with the press, provided another dramatic moment in court. She described discovering Robin's body on the roof months before the police investigation began. When she tried to escape with her belongings, she testified that Harrison threatened her with a machete and locked her in the apartment. Though she eventually got away and reported the body to police, her report was never investigated, a failing that would haunt the department. Throughout the proceedings, Harrison's behavior was erratic. He brought 4 monkey puppets to court one day, playing with them while his defense presented arguments. He giggled inappropriately when evidence about dismembered remains was discussed. His demeanor seemed to swing between childlike confusion and inappropriate cheerfulness. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney King, methodically built their case. They presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Harrison's own confession. King argued that the consistent pattern of strangulation showed premeditation rather than accident, and that Harrison's efforts to hide the bodies demonstrated his awareness of guilt. Defense attorney Moldavsky pursued three alternative theories: that the women had died from drug overdoses, that someone else, possibly the landlord, had committed the murders, or that Harrison's severe mental illness and drug use had led to accidental deaths during sex. He particularly emphasized Harrison's documented history of mental health issues and his mother's testimony about his childhood hospitalization. The decision to waive a jury trial proved crucial. With Judge Latrone already familiar with much of the evidence, the trial proceeded more quickly than anticipated. The judge had to weigh not only the evidence but also the complex questions about Harrison's mental state and legal responsibility. Despite maintaining his innocence, Harrison was found guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of corpse charges for all 7 victims. As the verdict was read, he merely blinked, shook his head, and remarked, "Everything will work out just fine." His only request was for the return of his Cookie Monster puppet, which was no longer needed as evidence. The sentencing phase brought another surprising turn. Judge Latrone imposed 6 death sentences but ordered that they not be carried out until after Harrison served a life sentence. This unprecedented decision effectively meant Harrison would serve life without parole instead of facing immediate execution. The judge cited Harrison's neglected childhood and lack of prior criminal convictions as mitigating factors. The victims' families reacted differently to the sentence. Amelia Deschazer, Robin's mother, told reporters, "I guess justice was done. I still hate him." Leroy Artis, Sandra Garvin's father, expressed hope that time would help heal his family's wounds. The legal proceedings concluded with a strange mix of justice served and questions unresolved. While Harrison was convicted of all charges, debates about his mental state and true responsibility for his actions would continue through years of appeals. In later years, as attitudes toward executing mentally ill defendants evolved, Harrison's case would return to court. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court banned the execution of what it termed the mentally retarded. By December 2003, Harrison was deemed incompetent for execution. His death sentences were vacated, and his life sentence was reinstated. Today, at age 65, Harrison Graham serves as a minister in prison, his Cookie Monster puppet long gone, but the questions about his mental state and the nature of his crimes continuing to intrigue and disturb those who study the case.